Eat, sleep, bet, repeat. That's how we get down on the opening line at EliteSportsBetting.com. I'll be your host, Benny Ricciardi, and today we're going to talk a little bit about some NFL strength of schedule stuff. We don't really have a lot of sports back yet, although we are starting to get some of them coming online. So I figured we could take a little bit of a look ahead at a couple things that, whether or not it means anything to you today, it's something that will mean something to you in the near future. Now, the reason why I think this is a good thing for us to do is because I have a little bit of an unfair advantage here. I got my man Frank, and Frank, by trade, is a data scientist. And because he's a data scientist by trade, he gets me much better information than a lot of other people use, and that's why we love him over here. So what's going on, Frank? How you been, bro?
Good to hear that intro again, man. A couple of weeks here, we're getting golf, and it sounds like baseball and basketball are going to work out something. So hockey's got some crazy ideas. So we'll getting back into it here. It's good to be back instead of just sitting on the couch.
Yeah, and I mean, it's tough to do a show called The Opening Line, but there's no lines to open that we can really talk about here. So, we're going to need sports back pretty soon if we're going to do this. But like I said, today we're going to talk a little bit about strength of schedule and how you went about doing this and what we can actually do with the strength of schedule information that we have here for the NFL to kind of get us ready for NFL season. Now, I'm going to ask the first question here. When people think about strength of schedule, when you hear, talking heads on TV talk about it, when you see some people even write about it, one of the things that always drives me nuts is they would talk about strength of schedule for the upcoming season based on teams' record and teams' totals and everything for last year. So just real quick, as somebody who, is a data scientist and puts this stuff together, why is that the worst way to look at strength of schedule?
Yeah, well, it's probably the second worst way. The worst way would be, their subjective analysis of just looking at it and saying, oh, well, I think this team's going to be good, so this schedule's hard, or I think this team's going to be bad, or this schedule's easy. So, it's not the worst way because there's a not ton of turnover in the NFL, but this season with the quarterback shuffling around with a lot of new coordinators and head coaches coming in, at least it feels like that way from a normal season. It's not a very good way to go about it. Like, do we really know what we're getting from Ron Rivera in Washington? Like, do we know what Carolina is going to be? No, but we can kind of make an assessment based on, what they were last year, what we can expect from the players, how good are they or bad are they with or without Cam Newton. How, we can kind of just keep making we can make data-informed decisions to say, okay, this is about where this team ranks. We can check the betting market to see how far we are, how close we are, how far away we are from a certain number, and then make the assessment on the schedule from then on out. So the way that we're going to do it and the way that I do it is I kind of independently go through each team and make the adjustments, mostly based on quarterbacks. Cause like I said, it's hard to say that even, like a wide receiver or something, it has more than a 1 point value to a team is probably not the case. So you're looking at a situation where we can kind of adjust teams up and down, from a, in a margin perspective, what we expect them to beat an average team by or something like that. Just some way of ranking the teams, and then we can come up with an expectation of strength of schedule that way based on how good the market and how good we think the team is going to be coming into the year, fully healthy and all that stuff. Now, it doesn't always work out that way. For example, they had a decent season last year, but if you take the Steelers, who played a whole season with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges, that team overall isn't that much better this year other than one player, but he makes them like almost a touchdown better per game, right? Like, so it's important to look at a team like the Steelers and say they're probably a little bit better than like a 7 or 8 win team, which is, they had like one of, if not the best defense in the NFL last year, or at least from an efficiency standpoint, and say like, okay, they're a touchdown better now offensively. What do we do with that? How do we judge that coming in? How many wins is that worth? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and there were, they also had a lot of injuries even on, outside of Roethlisberger on the offensive side of the football as well last year. So, that's a team that definitely has a chance to step forward. But you also have to take some of the good with the bad when you're doing this, because not only are they a team that looks like they should step forward, but they're also a team that's stepping forward into what could arguably be the best division in all of football this year. I mean,
Sure.
you have at least 3 teams in that division, if I'm not mistaken, that are projected for like 8 or more wins this year. So, that's not going to be an easy division. You're going to have some very tough games. Now, when people think about strength of schedule, the one thing I want everybody to remember is, yes, there is a bigger sample size with 16 games over the course of a whole season, but 16 is not really a huge sample size. I mean, if we're doing data analysis on anything, you normally want a much bigger sample size than just 16, but in the NFL, that's all we get because that's all the regular season games that we have. Now, the good and the bad with that, too, is the way that the NFL schedule is put together. You play everybody in your division twice. So a team that has a tough division is going to have a tougher strength of schedule than a team that has a weaker division where you got 2 cupcakes at the bottom of the division that are only expected to win 5, 6, 7 games.
Well, we've seen it with the Patriots for the last 20 years. Granted, they've had.
So as a Jets fan, yes.
They've proved it to be, that they've had one of the better head coach quarterback combos of all time for sure. No matter where they were playing, they would be good, but they wouldn't have been as good if the other 3 teams weren't dog shit outside of maybe 3 or 4 years. They would have never been able to do that. Just eventually one of those teams should have been better. So it was just a perfect storm of having these great players, but also playing against 3 just awful teams where they were almost guaranteed 5 wins to start the year every year as long as Tom Brady or even a decent backups on the field.
I was just going to say, even the year Tom Brady was hurt, it still really didn't change too much for them over there.
Right.
And then again, another little quirk that goes along with the NFL schedule is, every division plays crossover games with one other division. So if you get stuck playing, the Ravens, the Steelers, and the Browns this year, and even the Bengals, I mean, they could turn out to surprise some people and be a decent team with, the young guys that they added and the things they've done there. You're going to have a much tougher schedule if that's the crossover division you have than if you're playing, let's go to the AFC East and say if you're playing a Tom Brady-less Patriots team, a, perpetually shitty Jets team as a Jets fan, I'm allowed to say that, a Miami Dolphins team that maybe they got a little bit better, but this is still, the Ryan Fitzpatrick landing spot and basically just a bunch of guys.
Just playing the Bills who have an unproven kind of very random quarterback who could be really good or really bad with a decent defense, but you could get Josh Allen on a bad day, and there you go. That's the only tough game you're going to play in that setup.
Yep. So that's really the way that it breaks down. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen here, and my screen here is the numbers that Frank basically ran and put up here. So Frank, just kind of explain to everybody what these 2 columns are, what they represent, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can kind of use these numbers, whether it be for, building your fantasy teams or getting ready to make some of your sports bets or, anything along those lines.
Sure. So X wins, expected wins, that's pretty obvious there. That's how many wins I expect each team to have. And strength of schedule is basically, I shouldn't say basically, it's literally how many points per game their opponents are above average coming into the season. So without really having a better way to do it, I figured I'd do it by points. I could maybe do it by like win percentage, but it's not really, it's hard to calculate that in your head or kind of understand that. So I went with points per game above average or below average team would play. So if you look at, let's look at one that's kind of easier. So the Falcons have the toughest strength of schedule here. So they're plus 1.349. You can see them in the 21st spot there, the way that it's ranked. Plus 1.349, which is pretty remarkable. So their average setup, their average game this year out of their 16 games, their team, the collective team that they're playing is almost 1.5 points better than average coming into the season. Now, this could change, right? Like if Tom Brady gets hurt and Drew Brees is hurt or is really bad because he's old, and the Carolina is really bad, then they're going to end up getting into a situation where all these things change very rapidly, and we could potentially recalculate this at the end of the season or at the midway point and see what's going on. But injuries and things affect that. But coming into the season, the Falcons have the hardest schedule in the NFL. So a lot of that has to do with their road schedule. As I just started clicking through this and looking, once I simulated the season,
Mm-hmm.
and the Falcons are a decent team, but unfortunately they're only projected for 7.5 wins because of how tough their schedule are. They play at Dallas, at Green Bay, at Minnesota, at New Orleans, of course, at the Chargers, at the Chiefs, and at the Bucs. I mean, it's not easy going through that schedule. It's just plain and simple. And that's even me underrating probably teams like the Bucs more than the market has so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was gonna say it's pretty interesting. That was one of the things that popped out to me when you sent me the list and I started looking at it. You look at the teams in that division. You got the Saints, who have a somewhat easy schedule, almost a -1 in expected points against opponents there. You have Tampa Bay, who's along the same lines, and I'm with you.
Tampa Bay is the easiest strength of schedule this year, which bodes well for Tom, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And it's also why, I mean, I took the under on Tampa Bay at that 10 total right there. I see you have it at 8.5 here expected wins, so that's good because that gives me a 1.5 win cushion on my bet. I feel like that's the team that's a little bit over bet this year. But I also think that when you're looking at the strength of schedule as well, the fact that most people are expecting both Tampa Bay and New Orleans to walk away with 10 plus wins, or at least Vegas it has them both walking away with 10 plus wins. You look at that division, you have two of the better teams, arguably, and then two of the worst teams, or two of the teams that people are expecting to be the worst here, in Carolina and Atlanta this year. So, there's a big difference between the haves and the have-nots. And like I said, that was one of the ones that kind of popped out to me as well here. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about when I was looking through it, some of the teams at the top here, the Baltimore Ravens minus 0.51. Now, again, we have this list sorted, based on the expected wins. You could also sort it based on the points as well. When you do that, the Ravens are actually one of the softer schedules in the league this year, which was surprising to me because we talked about how they are in a pretty tough division. So I guess their softer schedule really has a lot more to do with who they play outside of their division this year, right?
Yeah. So, now I will preface this with these are my expectations. So the strength of schedule is based on what I expect from a team. So I'm a little bit softer on the Browns, I will say. And I do think the Bengals are bad. I think everyone thinks that. But if you're looking at their away schedule right now, they play at Houston, which got worse, at Washington, at Philly. Philly's decent, but they're an 8-9 win team, right? At Indianapolis, who I'm not real sure. At a bad Patriots team, and that's another team that I've underrated as well compared to the market is the Patriots. It's hard to say, obviously, but that game doesn't carry as much weight as maybe they would have in the past. And then they get teams like the Chiefs at home, they get the Titans at home, they get the Cowboys at home. So you start to look at a situation where you look at the Falcons, for example, and they play all of their tough games on the road, which puts them at a 3-point disadvantage right off the bat. And then you get the Ravens, who play all their tough games at home, which gives them a 3-point advantage, right off the bat. And, I know a lot of people are going to look at this and say, oh, the Ravens aren't better than the Chiefs. You're probably right, because if you look at the strength of schedule, the Chiefs, given their schedule, would be higher up than the Ravens would be. They just have about a point advantage per game. The Ravens have a point advantage per game, which is pretty remarkable. Again, based off my rankings, which definitely have, I don't want to say a bias, but if in this situation, there's two teams that the Ravens are playing that I maybe underrate, and there may be teams the Chiefs are playing that I'm overrating a little bit.
Yep. So, I mean, that's one way that, what Frank is breaking down here is one way you can kind of look at some of these things and kind of understand them and be able to use them this year. Again, he's not saying that if you have Kansas City playing Baltimore straight up, Kansas City is going to lose to Baltimore because Baltimore's a better team. Right. What he's saying is because Kansas City has a tougher schedule, there's a better chance that Baltimore ends up with more victories, which could give them home field advantage, which could be the advantage that they get out of having the softer schedule this year.
And when I'm looking at the win totals, I think there's two best teams, which I would say that the Ravens and Chiefs. And then if you look at the win totals, they think the same thing, because you can get an 11 on the Ravens at -110, or you can get 11.5 with the Chiefs, and the under vig is -130, which is pretty much the same number. They just don't want you getting, they're not going to give you the 11 push. Basically, they're giving you the loss on the 11 for the Chiefs. So, not only me, but the market tends to think that these teams are pretty close.
Yeah, and one thing that I've always noticed about this, however you put together your strength of schedule in the off season, as long as you're not doing something stupid like just putting it all based on last year's win totals or something like that. Really, the middle is kind of fungy for me. Like you're gonna have a bunch of teams in the middle here that really you're not taking too much. You're not going to put too much stock into the numbers that you see with all these teams that are kind of in the middle. What I really like to look at when you're doing something like this is the outliers. Like, give me the teams that have the softest schedule by far and the hardest schedule by far, because those are things that you can kind of look at. And for example, here, you look at the Ravens, right? The Ravens are a team here that we're looking at with an expected win total of almost 11.5. They're half a point per game better than their opponents on the offensive side of the ball. If you're doing a season-long fantasy draft, the Ravens running game is going to be a team that I would want to have exposure to, because you figure if this is a team that's going to win 11 or 12 games, they're going to be playing with a lot of leads against some of these bad teams because of these numbers here. That's something that I think would be safe to invest in. Now, do I want to invest in the Ravens running backs this year? I don't know. It could be tough with them bringing in the rookie, and then you got a 31 or 32-year-old Mark Ingram. Like, you don't even know exactly which piece of it you want. Plus, you're going to have Lamar Jackson using his legs and running quite a bit as well. But it's one of those things that you can kind of look at here, as opposed to the Atlanta Falcons running game. The Atlanta Falcons with a lower win total, with a, expected points per game of their opponents being much higher. This might not be the year to invest in their new running back, Todd Gurley, who they just brought in, because there's a good chance that this could be a pass-heavy team. Now, on the flip side, if you're looking to invest in some wide receivers here in a draft, there's a good chance Atlanta's going to be playing from behind quite a bit this year based on these numbers if everything works out. So, that's one of the ways that you can kind of use these numbers if you're playing season-long fantasy and kind of give yourself a opportunity to have the running games or the ground attack or the defense of some of these teams that we're expecting to have a high win total with kind of a softer schedule. And then on the flip side, you kind of want to have the passing game of some of these teams that, have a lower win total and have a much tougher strength of schedule because, again, you look at the Atlanta Falcons, if they're playing from behind against the Saints and against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, whose run defense was a lot better than their pass defense last year, this could be one of those places where you could find some of those guys, or it could be the thing that you use as a deciding factor between, do I take the guy on Atlanta or do I take the guy on, San Francisco, who's probably likely to have another 10.5 wins and keep running the football there. So that's one of the ways that you can use it here. Do you do, I know you don't do a lot of futures betting in general because you don't want to keep your money tied up for a while, but have you ever noticed how sticky would be the word I want to use, that these things are from beginning of the season to the end of the season? When you look at the strength of schedule, obviously injuries and a million other variables are going to come into play during a season. But, as a rough estimate, how have you seen something like this kind of work out?
Like, do you mean how much does the strength schedule change throughout the season?
Well, I was just saying, like, from what you're looking at preseason to, the end of the season, how it works out. Like right now we're looking at, the Ravens, the Chiefs, the Niners, and the Saints being the teams that, you're projecting for 10.5 wins or so. How close to 10.5 wins does that normally come, regardless of whether we get like a major injury to, Drew Brees or Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes or something like that.
Right. I mean, they're going to change quite a bit in a lot of cases now. The NFL isn't so much the NBA in that it's easily predicted, given the season. But part of that is because of the 16-game issue, right? Like if we had NFL teams playing 82 games, it'd be a lot closer because a lot of that variance would be sucked out of there. The cream rises to the top, as they'd say. I mean, could you imagine playing an NBA season with, with 16 games, or a baseball season with 16 games, you'd be like, what the hell? If one guy gets hurt for a week, it's over, right? Like you're
Yeah, Giannis misses a couple games, and well, I don't know. They actually win anyway without him, so it doesn't really make a difference.
yeah,
Somebody else like that, I get the point.
right. So with you saw it with the Chiefs last year. They win the Super Bowl. Mahomes goes down. They kind of managed it, and then they win the Super Bowl. But I don't even remember how many games they won. But certainly that affected their win total by quite a bit, because it's probably almost a 10-point difference to the backup, right? So he's easily the most valuable player in the NFL right now.
Yeah, so, I mean, I remember the one game he missed. They swung from like a 3-point underdog to like a 5-point favorite as soon as the announcement came that he was in. Because I remember we were all hopping on it as fast as we could before the books kind of took that down.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, most premier quarterbacks, Tom Brady in his prime was like 8 points. Usually see like 6 points in there somewhere. But I mean, I would say Mahomes is every bit of 9 points right now. So yeah, I mean, it also, I guess your backup and your coach also matter. But if you look at so some teams are going to drop off drastically, and some teams are going to rise up drastically. If the Bengals are okay, or the Panthers end up being decent with all of their new changes, then you're going to see these things start to rise up. A team like that starts 3-1. They might not be very good. They might win 3 times on last minute field goals, but they end up that win total could really shoot up despite not having, that good of a talent base there, where you could come in on the other side and say, okay, this team isn't very good. 2 years ago with the Browns, they kept missing field goals in the fourth quarter to lose, and they just would miss field goal, miss. Like, you could have made an argument at one point that they should have been 4-1, and they were 1-4. That was the Baker and Odell first year and all that. So it's like, you could make there's very little things in an NFL season that can completely change the outcome of the season and outcome of a game. There's so many times there's one review, one penalty, one play that changes the outcome of a football game. So you will see a bit more variance here than, say, in an NBA season, but I would say places like baseball, hockey have a bit more variance than what the NFL still will have. I mean, if you have a healthy Chiefs team, I would be surprised if they won less than 10 games.
All right, so there you go. The one thing I wanted to make sure everybody understood about today is, if you see anybody talking about on TV or writing about, strength of schedule using some random metric like last year's numbers, or, how they think is going to go, that's the guy that you don't want to be listening to for advice that you're willing to put money on and make actionable, whether it be through fantasy or through, the betting side of everything out there. Basically what you want to be able to do is use some kind of data that has a little bit more of a predictive value than,
right.
Just somebody's gut feeling, or, the way things worked out last year. Because remember, I mean, you know what? One of the things that I've been telling people, I think one of the most underrated things going into this season is going to be the New England Patriots. And people think I'm crazy right here, but something that I have always noticed with NFL football is coaches, if you can only give me one piece of information to kind of bet on for the season, if you bet on coaches, you're probably going to be in a pretty decent situation by the end of the year, because good coaches are going to figure things out. We've seen the New England Patriots without Tom Brady before. They did pretty well. The Tom Brady that they lost last year is not peak Tom Brady either. So you're not looking at them losing a guy that, is going to make an 8-point difference like Frank was talking about. You're looking at a guy who is probably still better than the league average quarterback, arguably, but not by much at this point in time. So remember, the outliers on that list are really the ones that you want to look at here. The teams that are really getting the biggest boost or the biggest drop, those are the ones that will probably still have something. Because remember, just because the strength of schedule looks tough at the beginning of the year, like we're looking at it now, doesn't mean that one of these teams along the way isn't going to lose their quarterback, or is it going to have their 2 or 3 stud defensive players not there. And just changing one little thing like that could change the win totals for 4 or 5 different teams as it kind of just snowballs all the way down here. So remember, this is a good number to look at. It kind of gives you a little bit of an idea, gives you a better idea than it does of just looking at last year's totals. But this isn't the kind of thing where, if you bet all 32 of these numbers that throw out there, you're not going to go 32 for 32, because there are too many other variables that come into play throughout the season, but it is a good thing to use to start there. So, Frank, anything you want to add to that before we sign off?
No, I mean you make good points there, and you can use those numbers for your win totals or whatever you might want to bet on there, but screenshot them, use them however you'd like. With I will preface it that there's still probably transactions to be had. I don't see anyone having a game changing quarterback type move or a coaching type move that unless unless Dak sits out or something crazy like that. But I don't think I wasn't betting on hit their win total anyway. So he doesn't seem like someone that would do that. But things like that could still happen. But I'll adjust these numbers based on that. But coming into the season, it seems like all the big players are pretty set. So check those out. Realize that teams like Carolina and Washington, some of these bottom end teams, Cincinnati, we don't really know what we're getting from the coaches. So, it's hard to say, they could just go like crazy college style. We've seen these college coaches come up and kind of pull back a little bit. We've seen, coaches come up and go crazy, like the Eagles did a few years ago. So, we'll see how it all plays out. And like you said, these are very fluid numbers at the moment.
Yeah, and especially some of these teams with these younger quarterbacks, it's going to be a little bit tough. We don't know if we're going to have a normal training. Well, we're already not having the normal training camp that they would from, being drafted at this point in time. So you really don't know how some of those younger guys or some of those newer guys coming over, whether it be a Brady or a Rivers. I mean, we had a lot of quarterbacks kind of change teams here that are going to need to learn some new systems and kind of get some timing down with some of these wide receivers. Depending on how things work out, we might not even have some of that stuff coming in the preseason. So just another thing. And then even during the season, you talked about the home field advantage. If we're playing in empty stadiums, the home field advantage might not be as big as it, as it used to be and things like that. So more than any other year, there's a lot of noise coming into this NFL season. But again, if you stick to data, if you stick to numbers that you could actually quantify, you're going to be better off than the guy who's just kind of going from the gut. And that's the last. Oh, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say definitely. I just want to put one more thing out there. I didn't adjust the Bengals at all with Burrow coming in, and I've got him at 5.5 wins. Their total's like 6, a little bit big under. So they're seeing he's maybe worth like half a win. So that kind of goes along with there is no idea on what quarterbacks right now, even from a rookie standpoint. I've made Twitter threads about this. I've talked about this ad nauseum. I don't think anyone knows how to evaluate quarterbacks until they've had at least a handful of years in the NFL. So if any of you think that, we understand how good or bad Jarrett Stidham is, how good or bad Joe Burrow is, or Herbert or any of these guys, we don't. And the win totals will reflect that every time. If Burrow was going to be some top talent or they thought he was going to be some top talent or the odds were that he was going to be some top talent, we would see them much higher than 6 right now.
Yeah, and remember they also have a brutal division that they have to get through.
Yeah, and it's not to say that he won't be. It's just that nobody knows how to evaluate quarterbacks. That's just the plain fact. So until there's a handful of years worth of data here, we don't really know how good any of these guys are. So again, with the variance, just realize that there's going to be a lot in this.
Yep. So there you go. For Frank, this is Benny signing off for another episode of The Opening Line at EliteSportsBetting.com.